New York's architecture did not begin with towers or grids, but with land, water, and the slow human instinct to mark shelter against an unpredictable environment. Long before stone or brick defined the skyline, the Lenape people lived lightly on Manhattan Island, shaping space through seasonal movement, bark-covered structures, and communal gathering places that blended with forests, rivers, and tidal shores. Their architecture was not meant to dominate the land, but to exist in rhythm with it, leaving few permanent traces, yet establishing the first spatial understanding of the island. When Dutch settlers arrived in the early 17th century, they brought with them a radically different architectural mindset, one rooted in ownership, defense, and permanence. New Amsterdam began as a trading post, its earliest buildings made of wood, clustered close together for protection and efficiency. Roofs were steep, walls were thick, and the layout followed the irregular contours of the southern tip of Manhattan rather than any grand plan. Architecture here was practical, cautious, and modest, shaped by harsh winters, limited resources, and constant uncertainty. As the settlement passed from Dutch to English control and became New York, architecture slowly transformed from survival-based construction into expressions of social order and authority. English colonial styles introduced symmetry, brick construction, and more formal street alignments. Georgian architecture took hold in the 18th century, reflecting ideals of balance, proportion, and hierarchy. Homes and public buildings alike followed predictable patterns: central doorways, evenly spaced windows, and restrained ornamentation. These structures communicated stability and allegiance to the British Crown, embedding political identity into the built environment. Churches, courthouses, and mansions rose alongside modest row houses, establishing an early architectural divide between classes that would persist throughout New York's history. Even at this stage, density began shaping design decisions, pushing buildings closer together and encouraging vertical stacking of functions. The American Revolution disrupted this architectural continuity, leaving parts of the city damaged and forcing a reconsideration of identity through design. After independence, New York turned toward Federal-style architecture, which retained classical influences but adapted them into lighter, more refined forms. Decorative elements became subtler, proportions more elegant, and buildings reflected the young nation's desire to appear cultured yet distinct from European monarchies. Architecture became a statement of democratic aspiration, even as wealth disparities remained visible in materials and scale. The city expanded northward, and row houses became a dominant residential form, efficient, repeatable, and well-suited to narrow lots. Brick facades lined the streets, creating visual continuity while allowing individual owners slight variations in detail. The 19th century marked a turning point where architecture began racing to keep pace with explosive population growth, industrialization, and immigration. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 imposed a rigid grid over Manhattan, an act of architectural planning that prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. This grid reshaped how buildings were conceived, encouraging uniform lot sizes and predictable development patterns. Architecture adapted to this imposed order, producing long blocks of nearly identical structures that maximized land use. As waves of immigrants arrived, tenement buildings emerged as a response to housing demand. These structures were often overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and minimally designed, revealing how architecture could reflect social neglect as clearly as ambition. Narrow staircases, shared courtyards, and dark interiors became defining features of working-class life, embedding inequality into the city's physical form. At the same time, wealth generated by commerce and industry fueled architectural experimentation and extravagance. Greek Revival and later Gothic Revival styles gained popularity, particularly for institutional and religious buildings. Columns, pediments, pointed arches, and ornate detailing transformed the cityscape, signaling cultural aspiration and moral authority. Architecture became a tool for legitimacy as banks adopted classical forms to imply stability and churches reached upward to inspire reverence. Cast iron construction introduced new possibilities, especially in commercial districts like Soho, where prefabricated facades allowed for rapid construction and decorative uniformity. These buildings balanced ornament with efficiency, foreshadowing the industrial logic that would later dominate skyscraper design. As the century progressed, technological advances began reshaping architectural limits. The introduction of elevators, steel framing, and improved fireproofing methods opened the door to vertical construction. Land values in lower Manhattan soared, making height economically advantageous. Early skyscrapers emerged cautiously, blending traditional masonry aesthetics with new structural systems hidden beneath the surface. Buildings like these still relied on historical styles for their appearance, using arches, cornices, and classical detailing to make the unfamiliar acceptable. Architecture was negotiating between innovation and tradition, masking radical structural changes behind familiar visual language. The late 19th century also saw the rise of monumental civic architecture, reflecting New York's growing confidence as a global city. Grand bridges, libraries, train stations, and public buildings asserted permanence and power. Stone, marble, and elaborate ornamentation conveyed cultural maturity and ambition. Architecture was no longer just about shelter or commerce, it was about identity, spectacle, and influence. These structures reshaped how New Yorkers experienced space, introducing awe and grandeur into everyday life. Yet, even as monuments rose, the city's architectural contradictions deepened, with luxury buildings standing near overcrowded tenements, each telling a different story of the same urban reality. By the time New York entered the 20th century, its architectural foundation had been laid through centuries of adaptation, conflict, and ambition. The city had learned to build quickly, densely, and symbolically, turning constraints into defining characteristics. Architecture had become both a response to and a driver of economic, social, and technological change. Every brick, beam, and street alignment carried traces of earlier decisions, setting the stage for an era when New York would push verticality, style, and scale to unprecedented heights. As the 20th century unfolded, New York's architecture entered a phase where ambition no longer asked permission from tradition. The skyline began to rise not as an accident of necessity, but as a declaration of power. Steel skeletons freed buildings from the limits of thick masonry walls, allowing height to increase dramatically while footprints remained small. This technological liberation coincided with fierce competition among corporations, banks, and real estate magnates, each eager to claim visibility in the crowded city. Architecture became a vertical race, where height itself symbolized success. Early skyscrapers adopted eclectic styles, dressing their steel frames in Gothic, Renaissance, or classical costumes. These buildings spoke two languages at once: modern engineering beneath, historical reassurance above. New York was inventing something entirely new while still clinging to the comfort of the old. The 1920s and early 1930s marked the golden age of skyscraper architecture, when Art Deco emerged as the city's defining visual language. Sharp lines, geometric patterns, stepped forms, and lavish materials reflected the energy, speed, and optimism of the machine age. Buildings like the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were not merely tall, they were theatrical, expressive, and symbolic. Zoning laws shaped their iconic silhouettes, forcing setbacks that gave rise to tiered towers that seemed to rise organically toward the sky. Architecture became a collaboration between law, economics, and aesthetics. These towers transformed the skyline into a sculptural composition, turning New York itself into a global image. For the first time, a city's architecture was instantly recognizable around the world. Yet beneath this architectural triumph lay economic fragility. The Great Depression halted construction and exposed the vulnerability of architecture to financial collapse. Many ambitious projects were abandoned or simplified, and architectural focus shifted toward functionality and restraint. When building resumed, it often favored efficiency over ornament. This period quietly prepared the ground for modernism, a movement that rejected historical decoration in favor of clean lines, open plans, and honest expression of materials. Architecture began to ask whether beauty could exist without embellishment, whether glass and steel alone could define dignity. After World War II, New York became a testing ground for modernist ideals. International-style architecture arrived with glass curtain walls, rectilinear forms, and an emphasis on volume rather than mass. Buildings like Lever House and the Seagram Building introduced a new aesthetic discipline to the city. These structures stood back from the street, creating open plazas and redefining the relationship between building and public space. Architecture now reflected corporate identity, projecting transparency, rationality, and control. The skyline grew calmer, more uniform, and more abstract, signaling a shift in values from spectacle to order. At the same time, this modernist vision often ignored the human scale, prioritizing efficiency over street life. Urban renewal policies reshaped large portions of the city during the mid-20th century. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for highways, housing projects, and civic complexes. Architecture became an instrument of planning ideology, often imposed without regard for existing communities. Tower-in-the-park housing developments promised light, air, and order, but frequently resulted in social isolation and neglect. These projects revealed the limits of architectural theory when separated from lived reality. Buildings alone could not solve social problems, and the failures of urban renewal left lasting scars on the city's fabric. By the 1970s, New York faced economic crisis, population decline, and widespread disinvestment. Architecture reflected this uncertainty through abandonment, decay, and improvisation. Factories and warehouses stood empty, their industrial architecture stripped of purpose. Yet from this decline emerged unexpected creativity. Artists began occupying lofts, transforming raw industrial spaces into studios and homes. These adaptive reuses redefined architectural value, proving that old structures could gain new life without demolition. The city learned that architecture was not only about building anew, but about reinterpreting what already existed. As the late 20th century progressed, architecture in New York became increasingly diverse, layered, and global. Postmodernism challenged modernist austerity by reintroducing color, symbolism, and historical reference. Buildings began to play with irony and context, acknowledging the city's architectural past while questioning its authority. At the same time, globalization brought international architects and influences, turning New York into a laboratory of competing ideas. Glass towers rose beside brownstones, minimalist forms coexisted with ornate facades, and the city embraced contradiction as its defining trait. Entering the 21st century, New York's architecture confronted new challenges: sustainability, resilience, and identity in an era of climate change and technological acceleration. Green buildings, adaptive reuse, and mixed-use developments reflected a growing awareness of environmental responsibility. Architecture began responding not only to economics and aesthetics, but to rising seas, energy consumption, and social equity. Tragedy also reshaped the city's architectural consciousness. The destruction of the World Trade Center forced a collective reckoning with symbolism, memory, and loss. Rebuilding became an emotional and ethical task, not just a technical one. Today, New York's architecture stands as a layered narrative rather than a single style or ideology. It is a city where centuries coexist vertically and horizontally, where indigenous landscapes echo beneath colonial streets, where Art Deco spires share the skyline with glass supertalls. Each era has left its imprint, sometimes harmonious, sometimes conflicting, but always revealing the values and anxieties of its time. Architecture in New York is not finished, nor stable. It is an ongoing process shaped by migration, money, politics, and imagination. The city continues to build upward and inward, rewriting its own history with every new structure, proving that architecture here is not merely about space, but about the constant reinvention of identity itself. That reinvention does not happen only through landmark towers or celebrated architects. It unfolds quietly in everyday buildings, streets, and neighborhoods where architecture absorbs the pressures of daily life. In recent decades, New York's growth has been defined as much by subtle transformations as by dramatic skylines. Formerly industrial waterfronts have been reimagined into residential and cultural zones, turning neglected edges of the city into desirable spaces. Old piers, rail yards, and warehouses have been adapted rather than erased, signaling a shift in architectural philosophy. Preservation and reuse now compete with demolition, reflecting a deeper understanding that memory itself is a material. Architecture has become a conversation between what the city was and what it might become. The rise of supertall residential towers in the early 21st century introduced a new chapter in this story. These slender buildings, engineered to rise to extraordinary heights on relatively small footprints, reflect the globalization of wealth and the transformation of real estate into an international commodity. Their glassy facades mirror the sky, often appearing weightless against the city's older masonry structures. Architecture here is less about housing local populations and more about symbolic presence and investment. These towers reshape not only the skyline but also the social geography of the city, casting literal and metaphorical shadows over surrounding neighborhoods. They provoke debates about access, equity, and the meaning of urban growth, reminding New York that architecture is never neutral. At street level, however, architecture continues to negotiate intimacy and density. Brownstones, tenements, and walk-up apartments remain central to the city's character, even as their uses evolve. Renovations and restorations blur the line between old and new, preserving facades while transforming interiors. This layering allows the city to change without losing its recognizable texture. Neighborhoods express their identities through architectural details, fire escapes clinging to brick walls, stoops serving as social thresholds, storefronts adapting to new communities. These elements, often overlooked, form the emotional architecture of New York, shaping how people move, gather, and belong. Public space has also become a critical focus of architectural thought. Projects that reclaim infrastructure for communal use demonstrate how design can reshape urban experience without massive construction. Elevated parks, waterfront promenades, and redesigned streets prioritize pedestrians and social interaction, challenging earlier car-dominated planning. Architecture here extends beyond buildings, influencing how space is shared and valued. These interventions suggest that the future of New York's architecture lies not only in height or novelty, but in connectivity and inclusivity. The city is learning to build not just upward, but outward into social life. Climate change has introduced a new urgency into architectural practice. Rising sea levels, stronger storms, and extreme heat force architects and planners to rethink resilience. Flood barriers, elevated structures, and adaptive landscapes are becoming essential components of design, particularly in coastal neighborhoods. Architecture is now asked to protect as well as inspire, to anticipate uncertainty rather than deny it. This shift echoes the city's earliest architectural impulses, when survival dictated form, closing a historical loop that links the present to the distant past. Technology continues to redefine how architecture is conceived and experienced. Digital modeling, sustainable materials, and smart systems influence everything from skyscrapers to small renovations. Buildings respond to their environment, dynamically managing energy, light, and air with increasing precision. Yet, even as technology advances, the core challenge remains human. New York's architecture must accommodate millions of lives, cultures, and stories within limited space. Every design choice reflects a balance between efficiency and empathy, innovation and memory. Ultimately, the history of architecture in New York is not a linear progression toward perfection, but a series of negotiations. Each era responds to the failures and ambitions of the one before it, layering solutions over unresolved tensions. The city's built environment records moments of confidence and crisis, inclusion and exclusion, imagination and excess. Architecture becomes a form of storytelling, written in steel, stone, glass, and concrete, telling not a single story, but countless overlapping ones. As New York continues to evolve, its architecture remains unfinished by definition. New buildings will rise, old ones will adapt or disappear, and debates over space, identity, and justice will persist. What makes the city unique is not any particular style or skyline, but its willingness to absorb change without losing its core intensity. Architecture in New York is a living archive, constantly rewritten by those who inhabit it. In that sense, the city itself is the architect, shaping and reshaping its form through the endless interplay of history, ambition, and human presence. That living archive keeps expanding because New York never reaches a point of architectural completion. Each generation inherits a city already crowded with decisions made by others and must find ways to insert itself into that dense physical memory. This pressure produces creativity as much as conflict. New architecture in New York is rarely freestanding in spirit. It is always reacting to neighboring buildings, to zoning laws, to historical expectations, to economic realities. Even the boldest designs must negotiate shadows, sightlines, and context. In this way, architecture here is less about isolated masterpieces and more about dialogue, sometimes tense, sometimes harmonious, between eras. Cultural diversity continues to shape this dialogue in subtle but powerful ways. Immigrant communities imprint their identities onto the city through religious buildings, community centers, and adapted commercial spaces. Mosques, synagogues, temples, and churches often occupy repurposed structures, transforming architectural meaning without altering the basic form. A former factory becomes a place of worship. A townhouse becomes a cultural hub. This adaptability reflects New York's social fluidity, where architecture serves as a flexible container for changing identities. The city's buildings become multilingual, speaking different cultural languages within the same walls over time. Housing remains one of the most defining and contentious architectural challenges. The tension between luxury development and affordable housing shapes neighborhoods and skylines alike. Architecture is asked to solve economic problems it did not create, leading to compromises that are visible in form and material. New residential buildings often combine multiple functions, housing, retail, community space, stacked vertically to maximize land use. This vertical mixing echoes the city's long-standing relationship with density, but now carries heightened social stakes. How space is divided, who has access to light, air, views, and safety, becomes an architectural expression of values. Preservation movements play an increasingly influential role in shaping New York's architectural future. Historic districts protect streetscapes from drastic change, freezing certain moments in time while the rest of the city accelerates forward. This creates a layered experience where past and present exist side by side, sometimes uneasily. Preservation is not just about aesthetics, it is about memory, identity, and resistance to erasure. At the same time, it raises questions about whose history is preserved and whose is overlooked. Architecture becomes a battleground of narratives, where bricks and cornices carry political meaning. Education, cultural institutions, and public buildings continue to redefine architectural ambition beyond commercial profit. Museums, libraries, and performance spaces experiment with form to invite public engagement and redefine civic presence. These buildings often strive for openness, transparency, and accessibility, countering the exclusivity associated with luxury towers. Architecture here acts as an invitation rather than a barrier, shaping how people encounter art, knowledge, and one another. Even when controversial, such structures expand the conversation about what public architecture can be in a city defined by private development. The emotional relationship between New Yorkers and their architecture should not be underestimated. Buildings become landmarks not because of design pedigree alone, but because of lived experience. A corner bodega, a subway entrance, a familiar facade glimpsed every morning becomes part of personal identity. Architecture anchors memory, turning places into emotional reference points. When buildings disappear, the loss is felt not only in the skyline, but in the psyche of the city. This attachment explains why architectural change in New York often provokes strong reactions. It is not merely physical alteration, but a reshaping of collective memory. Looking forward, uncertainty remains the most consistent condition shaping architecture in New York. Economic cycles rise and fall, technologies evolve, climate threats intensify, and social priorities shift. The city responds not with a single vision, but with accumulation new ideas layered onto old frameworks. This incremental evolution ensures resilience. Architecture in New York survives by adapting, absorbing shocks, and reinterpreting itself without erasing its past entirely. In the end, the history of architecture in New York is inseparable from the history of its people. Buildings are records of aspiration, struggle, compromise, and imagination made tangible. They reveal how a city learns from its mistakes and reinvents its ambitions. New York's architecture does not seek timeless perfection. It accepts imperfection as part of its identity. That acceptance allows the city to remain alive, restless, and unfinished, an urban form always in the process of becoming, shaped as much by future possibilities as by the weight of everything that has come before. That sense of becoming is what prevents New York's architecture from settling into nostalgia or rigidity. Even when styles repeat or reference the past, they do so with awareness that permanence is an illusion here. Buildings are designed with the understanding that their purpose may change, their interiors may be reconfigured, and their meanings may evolve beyond original intent. This awareness produces a particular architectural pragmatism. Structures must be strong yet flexible, iconic yet adaptable. In New York, durability is measured not only by materials, but by the capacity to be reinterpreted across generations. Infrastructure plays a quieter but equally decisive role in shaping architectural history. Subways, tunnels, bridges, and utilities form an invisible framework that dictates where and how buildings rise. The city's underground complexity constrains foundations, heights, and layouts, forcing architects to negotiate with what cannot be seen. These hidden systems are architectural forces in their own right, shaping density and movement as powerfully as zoning laws. New York's architecture is therefore both vertical and subterranean, existing above and below ground in a continuous exchange between structure and circulation. The relationship between architecture and economics remains inseparable. Financial booms leave behind bold skylines, recessions leave gaps, unfinished projects, and reused spaces. Each economic cycle writes itself into the city's physical form. Glass towers announce confidence, while adaptive reuse signals caution and ingenuity. Architecture records these fluctuations with remarkable honesty. Unlike written history, it cannot be revised without cost. Failed ideas stand as lessons in concrete and steel, reminding future builders of the consequences of excess or neglect. Global attention has turned New York into a reference point, a city studied, imitated, and critiqued worldwide. Its architectural experiments influence how other cities imagine density, vertical living, and mixed-use development. At the same time, New York absorbs global ideas, creating a feedback loop where international trends are filtered through local constraints. This exchange ensures that the city never becomes isolated in its thinking. Architecture here remains outward-looking, even when focused on local problems. Yet for all its scale and influence, New York's architecture ultimately derives meaning from human presence. A building without occupants is incomplete, regardless of design brilliance. The way people inhabit spaces, how they modify, personalize, and move through them, completes the architectural narrative. Fire escapes become social balconies, stoops become stages, rooftops become sanctuaries. These informal uses often outlast formal design intentions, proving that architecture is a collaboration between planner and inhabitant. As time continues, some structures will vanish, others will be preserved, and many will transform beyond recognition. What remains constant is the city's refusal to be defined by a single moment. New York's architectural history is not a closed book, but a manuscript still being written, with pages added, crossed out, and rewritten daily. Each new building contributes a sentence, sometimes a paragraph, occasionally a chapter, to an ever-expanding story. In this way, architecture in New York functions as both mirror and engine of the city's identity. It reflects ambition while generating it, records memory while making room for reinvention. The city does not simply contain architecture, it lives through it. Walls, windows, streets, and skylines become expressions of collective will, shaped by millions of decisions made over centuries. To trace the history of architecture in New York is therefore to trace the evolving relationship between people and possibility, a relationship defined not by completion, but by the enduring desire to build, rebuild, and imagine again. That enduring desire ensures that even moments of pause become part of the architectural rhythm. Periods when construction slows do not halt the city's architectural life. Instead, they redirect it inward. Maintenance, renovation, and reinterpretation take center stage. Buildings are cleaned, strengthened, subdivided, or merged, subtly altering how they function without changing how they appear. These quiet interventions rarely make headlines, yet they are essential to New York's survival. Architecture here is not only about new forms rising, but about existing ones being carefully sustained so the city can keep functioning under constant strain. The legal and regulatory framework surrounding architecture has grown increasingly complex, shaping design as decisively as aesthetics or technology. Zoning codes, landmark protections, environmental regulations, and community review processes form an invisible architecture of rules. Designers must navigate these constraints creatively, often turning limitations into defining features. Setbacks become terraces, height restrictions inspire sculptural massing, and preservation requirements lead to innovative interior solutions. In New York, architecture is as much about negotiation as imagination, and the final form of a building often reflects compromise as clearly as vision. Education and professional culture further influence the city's architectural evolution. Schools, studios, and firms treat New York as both classroom and laboratory. Young architects study the city by walking it, sketching it, and analyzing how buildings meet streets, how light enters narrow canyons, how old and new coexist. This constant observation feeds back into practice, reinforcing a culture where architecture is learned through immersion rather than abstraction. The city teaches its designers as much as they shape it, creating a feedback loop between experience and form. Social movements also leave their imprint on the built environment. Advocacy for accessibility reshapes entrances, sidewalks, and public interiors. Demands for safer streets influence building setbacks and ground floor transparency. Calls for environmental justice affect where green spaces, infrastructure investments, and resilient construction are prioritized. Architecture becomes a visible response to changing values, translating social pressure into spatial form. These changes may appear incremental, but over time they redefine how inclusive and humane the city feels. Even the skyline, often treated as a symbol of permanence, is in constant flux. Buildings once considered definitive are surpassed, altered, or reframed by new neighbors. What was once a dominant tower becomes part of a cluster. What was once controversial becomes familiar. Perspective shifts as the city grows, reminding observers that architectural meaning is relative. Height, style, and prominence are temporary conditions in a city where context never stops changing. Memory continues to exert a quiet pull on architectural decisions. Sites carry emotional weight, shaped by events that linger long after physical traces fade. Rebuilding in such places demands sensitivity, not only to structure but to collective feeling. Architecture must acknowledge absence as much as presence, using space, light, and form to express what cannot be rebuilt. In these moments, design becomes a form of listening, responding to history without trying to overwrite it. Through all these layers, New York's architecture maintains a unique tension between individual ambition and collective consequence. A single building can reshape traffic, shadows, property values, and neighborhood identity. Every design choice ripples outward, affecting lives beyond the site itself. This interconnectedness makes architecture here a public act, even when driven by private interests. The city constantly reminds its builders that no structure stands alone. As time moves forward, new materials, methods, and ideas will continue to enter the city's architectural bloodstream. Some will fade quickly, others will endure, becoming part of the city's visual and functional vocabulary. What persists is the process itself, the continual testing of how much can be built, how little space can hold so many lives, how memory and ambition can share the same ground. New York's architecture remains an unfinished conversation, carried on in steel frames and brick walls, in regulations and rebellions, in everyday use and extraordinary vision. And as long as the city continues to change, that conversation will not end, but deepen, adding new layers to a history that is always, inevitably, still in the making. That history in the making is sustained by contradiction, which has always been New York's most reliable architectural engine. The city demands speed but also endurance, novelty but familiarity, profit but meaning. These opposing forces never resolve themselves. Instead, they generate form. Architecture becomes the physical negotiation between what can be built quickly and what must last, between private ambition and public consequence. This tension gives New York its restless architectural energy, preventing stagnation even when change is resisted. The everyday experience of architecture in New York is shaped as much by movement as by form. Streets funnel bodies through canyons of stone and glass, subway stairs release crowds into sudden light, and doorways compress and expand space in seconds. Buildings are not static objects here. They are passages, filters, and thresholds. Architects must design for flow as much as for appearance. Lobbies become transitional landscapes, facades communicate speed or pause, and interiors anticipate constant turnover. Architecture responds to a city that is always in motion, where space is experienced briefly but repeatedly, accumulating meaning over time. Sound, light, and shadow also define New York's architectural character. Tall buildings alter wind patterns, amplify noise, and shape how sunlight reaches the street. These effects are not accidental, they become part of how the city feels. Morning light striking a glass tower, afternoon shadows stretching across brownstone stoops, neon reflections bouncing off wet pavement, these sensory moments turn architecture into atmosphere. The city is read not only through form but through experience, making architecture inseparable from mood and memory. Commercial architecture reveals another layer of the city's evolution. Storefronts change rapidly, adapting to shifting economies and cultures. Signage, window displays, and interior layouts transform buildings without altering. Genius or failure? Instead, the city's buildings stand as collaborative artifacts, shaped by forces larger than any single mind. In this sense, New York's architectural history is also a history of listening. Successful buildings respond to site, to climate, to community, to time. Those that ignore context may still stand, but they often struggle to belong. Belonging in New York is not guaranteed by scale or cost. It is earned through use, acceptance, and endurance. Architecture that survives is architecture that learns how to be inhabited. The city will continue to challenge its architects with impossible demands: more space, less land, more housing, fewer resources, more resilience, greater uncertainty. There will be no final solution, only evolving responses. And that is precisely what sustains New York's architectural vitality. The city does not seek closure. It thrives on continuity through change. So the story carries on, not toward an ending, but into further layers. Every scaffold, every renovation, every controversial proposal becomes part of the narrative. Architecture in New York remains an act of faith that building, despite its risks and contradictions, is still worth doing. As long as people arrive with dreams, as long as space remains contested and desired, the city will keep reshaping itself. And its architecture will continue to speak, not with a singular structure. This surface-level mutability allows architecture to keep pace with trends while retaining deeper continuity. A single building may house dozens of businesses over decades, each leaving faint traces behind. These palimpsests of use remind the city that architecture's most constant function is adaptability. The relationship between architecture and labor is deeply embedded in New York's built form. Construction itself becomes a social act, involving thousands of workers whose skills and risks make the skyline possible. Scaffolding, cranes, and temporary structures are permanent features of the cityscape, signaling that building is never finished. Architecture here is always under construction in both literal and metaphorical terms. This visibility of process reinforces the idea that the city is actively being made, not passively inherited. Art and architecture frequently intersect in New York, blurring boundaries between structure and expression. Murals, installations, and temporary interventions alter how buildings are perceived without changing their form. These acts challenge the authority of architecture by reminding viewers that meaning is not fixed. A blank wall becomes a statement, a vacant lot becomes a gallery, a facade becomes a canvas. The city allows architecture to be questioned, reinterpreted, and sometimes subverted, keeping it alive within cultural discourse. Time alters buildings unevenly, and New York embraces this irregular aging. Some structures are meticulously restored, others weather naturally, carrying scars of use and neglect. This unevenness creates visual richness, revealing layers of care, abandonment, and revival. Architecture here does not strive for uniform aging, it accepts patchwork continuity. This acceptance allows the city to retain authenticity, resisting the illusion of seamless perfection. As the future unfolds, architecture in New York will continue to grapple with scale, how to house millions without erasing individuality, how to grow without losing intimacy. Solutions will remain provisional, shaped by experimentation rather than final answers. New forms will emerge, some celebrated, some contested, all contributing to the ongoing narrative. The city will keep absorbing ideas, rejecting some, transforming others, and layering them onto what already exists. In this endless process, architecture becomes less about monuments and more about relationships between past and future, structure and use, power and presence. New York's buildings do not simply stand, they participate. They influence behavior, shape identity, and reflect collective priorities. The history of architecture in New York is therefore not a record of styles alone, but a record of how a city continuously learns how to live with itself. And as long as that learning continues, the architecture of New York will remain unfinished, evolving with every generation that dares to add its mark to a city that is always becoming something new. That learning process deepens as the city confronts questions that architecture alone cannot answer, yet must help frame. Issues of inequality, displacement, and belonging press against walls and windows, asking buildings to do more than shelter or impress. In New York, architecture increasingly carries moral weight. Design choices signal who is welcome, who is protected, and who is pushed aside. A ramp, a bench, a public restroom, a shaded plaza, small architectural decisions can quietly redefine dignity in a crowded city. The built environment becomes a daily negotiation of fairness, expressed not in slogans but in space. Neighborhood identity continues to evolve through this lens. Architecture no longer simply reflects culture, it actively shapes it. When new buildings arrive, they bring new rhythms of life, different hours, different patterns of movement, different expectations of privacy and interaction. Longtime residents experience architecture not as abstract design, but as a force that alters memory and routine. A familiar skyline changes, a street grows quieter or louder, sunlight shifts. These subtle changes accumulate, reshaping how communities understand themselves. Architecture becomes part of personal history, entwined with stories of arrival, survival, and adaptation. The role of imagination in New York's architecture remains essential. Despite regulation, cost, and constraint, moments of daring still emerge. Architects test materials, push proportions, and reframe public space in ways that challenge habit. These experiments do not always succeed, but even failure contributes to the city's knowledge. In New York, boldness is tolerated because the city itself is a product of risk. The willingness to attempt the unproven keeps architecture from becoming purely conservative, even when pressure to conform is strong. Temporary architecture has gained renewed importance in this context. Pavilions, Pop-up structures and event-based installations allow the city to test ideas without permanent commitment. These fleeting forms introduce play, speculation, and critique into the urban fabric. They remind residents that architecture does not have to be eternal to be meaningful. Sometimes, its power lies precisely in its impermanence. By allowing structures to appear and disappear, New York gives itself permission to imagine alternatives to its current form. The relationship between private interiors and public exteriors continues to blur. Large windows, transparent facades, and shared spaces expose fragments of private life to the street, while public areas increasingly invite informal occupation. Architecture mediates this exchange, deciding how much the city sees itself reflected back. In New York, this constant visual dialogue reinforces a sense of collective presence. Even alone, residents remain aware of others through lighted windows, passing shadows, and layered sounds. Buildings become vessels of shared awareness, connecting lives without requiring direct contact. Memory persists not only in preserved landmarks, but in patterns of reuse. A building that has changed function many times carries a quiet density of past lives. Scratches on floors, worn steps, altered layouts, these traces resist complete erasure. New York's architecture often reveals its history through these imperfections, allowing the past to coexist with the present. This coexistence gives the city depth, preventing it from feeling manufactured or hollow despite constant renewal. As architectural discourse continues, the idea of authorship becomes less clear. Who designs New York? The architect, the developer, the planner, the resident, the market, the law. The answer is always collective. Architecture here emerges from overlapping intentions, compromises, and unintended consequences. This complexity resists simple narratives of voice, but with a chorus of forms, memories, and ambitions, endlessly unfinished, endlessly alive. That living chorus grows richer as time stretches forward, because New York never allows architecture to settle into silence. Even buildings that seem complete continue to change through how they are perceived. A structure once seen as radical becomes ordinary. One dismissed as ugly gains affection through familiarity. Meaning shifts without a single brick moving. This slow transformation of perception is one of the city's most subtle architectural processes. New York teaches that architecture is not frozen at the moment of completion. It matures alongside the people who live with it. Generational turnover adds another layer to this evolution. Each generation inherits the same streets, but interprets them differently. What older residents remember as decline, younger ones may experience as raw potential. Architecture becomes a bridge between these viewpoints, holding conflicting memories within the same form. A warehouse that once symbolized lost jobs becomes a symbol of creative rebirth. A modest walk-up once seen as temporary becomes echoished home. Buildings absorb these shifting narratives, becoming containers for changing emotional truths. The city's relationship with risk continues to define how architecture moves forward. Building in New York has always involved betting on the future, on population growth, economic stability, cultural relevance. Some bets succeed spectacularly, others fail quietly. Empty floors, stalled projects, and repurposed plans all tell stories of expectation and adjustment. Architecture records these gambles honestly. Unlike theoretical visions, built form must live with the consequences of optimism and error. This accountability gives New York's architecture a particular seriousness beneath its boldness. Even nature, long suppressed beneath pavement and steel, reasserts itself as a shaping force. Parks, street trees, green roofs, and restored shorelines are not decorative afterthoughts, but architectural responses to ecological pressure. The city learns to weave natural systems back into its dense fabric, acknowledging that survival depends on cooperation rather than domination. This marks a philosophical shift from earlier eras, when architecture sought to conquer environment rather than collaborate with it. New York's future form will likely reflect this humility, blending hard edges with living systems. Tour also continues to shape how time is experienced in the city. Fast spaces, stations, corridors, entrances compress experience, while slow spaces, parks, libraries, stoops stretch it. The balance between these tempos affects mental and social health. Increasingly, designers recognize that not all efficiency is humane. In response, architecture begins to reintroduce pause into a city defined by urgency. This recalibration suggests that progress is no longer measured only by speed or height, but by quality of experience. What remains remarkable is the city's tolerance for difference. New York does not demand architectural consensus. Contradiction is allowed to stand openly: luxury towers beside aging tenements, minimalist facades across from ornate cornices, silence within steps of chaos. This coexistence creates friction, but also freedom. Architecture here is not required to agree with its neighbors, it must only survive among them. That tolerance enables experimentation and preserves character simultaneously. As the city continues to absorb newcomers, people, ideas, technologies, its architecture will respond in ways that cannot be fully predicted. Plans will change, intentions will be revised, and uses will evolve beyond original design. This unpredictability is not a flaw. It is the city's defining condition. Architecture in New York succeeds not by controlling the future, but by remaining open to it. So the narrative moves forward, not in straight lines, but in layers, overlaps, and returns. Every addition becomes part of a dense architectural memory that informs what comes next. New York does not erase itself to begin again. It builds over, around, and through what already exists. Its architecture is cumulative, restless, and resilient. And as long as the city continues to attract ambition, struggle, and imagination, the story will keep unfolding. There will always be another scaffold rising, another interior being reworked, another street quietly transformed. Architecture in New York will continue to be less about arriving at an ideal form and more about sustaining an ongoing relationship between people and space. That relationship, imperfect, contested, and endlessly renewed, is the true architecture of the city, and it has no final chapter. That absence of a final chapter is what gives New York's architecture its distinctive emotional charge. The city never promises resolution, it offers continuity instead. Buildings participate in a long conversation where answers are provisional and every solution generates new questions. This ongoing exchange keeps architecture from becoming complacent. In New York, even success is temporary because the context around it never stops shifting. A building admired today must renegotiate its relevance tomorrow, adapting to new neighbors, new technologies, and new social expectations. The scale of the city intensifies this process. With millions of people sharing limited space, architecture becomes a daily mediator of friction. Walls separate, but they also bring lives into close proximity. Windows offer privacy while exposing movement and light. Balconies, fire escapes, and rooftops create semi-public zones that blur boundaries between isolation and connection. These in-between spaces are where New York's architectural character often reveals itself most clearly. They are not grand or monumental, yet they shape social behavior more directly than iconic towers ever could. Architecture also records silence as much as activity. Empty lots, boarded facades, and paused construction sites mark moments when the city hesitates. These gaps are not voids, they are intervals of waiting, often filled with speculation and possibility. Historically, such pauses have preceded reinvention. A vacant structure becomes a canvas for new use, a stalled project reemerges under different priorities. New York's architecture teaches that absence can be as informative as presence, revealing where pressures ease and new directions may emerge. The city's architectural memory is further deepened by repetition. Certain forms return again and again: row houses, corner stores, towers with setbacks, not because imagination has failed, but because these forms have proven resilient. Each repetition introduces subtle variation, shaped by era, technology, and regulation. Over time, these variations accumulate into a rich vocabulary. Architecture in New York evolves less through radical rupture than through persistent refinement, testing familiar ideas under new conditions. Conflict remains a powerful architectural driver. Community opposition, political debate, and public scrutiny influence what gets built and how. These confrontations slow projects, reshape designs, and sometimes halt them entirely. While often frustrating, this resistance embeds democracy into the built environment. Architecture becomes accountable, forced to justify its presence and impact. The resulting buildings carry traces of these struggles, shaped not only by design intent, but by negotiation and compromise. The city's verticality continues to challenge human perception. Looking up and down becomes a constant act, altering how scale is understood. Architecture in New York trains the eye to read height intuitively, to measure distance not just horizontally but vertically. This three-dimensional awareness distinguishes the city from flatter urban landscapes. Buildings become reference points in a shared mental map, helping residents orient themselves within complexity. Night transforms architecture yet again. Artificial light redraws facades, erases some forms, emphasizes others. Office towers glow, residential windows pulse with individual lives, streets reflect illumination upward. At night, architecture becomes narrative, revealing occupancy and rhythm. The city reads differently after dark, and buildings participate actively in that transformation. This daily cycle reinforces the idea that architecture is temporal, experienced differently depending on hour and season. As years pass, the distinction between background and foreground shifts. Structures once considered ordinary become valued precisely because they survived. What endures gains meaning through persistence. New York's architecture teaches patience in this way, reminding observers that significance is often assigned long after construction ends. Time is the city's most influential critic. All of this ensures that architecture in New York remains inseparable from lived experience. It is not an abstract discipline unfolding on drawing boards alone, but a constant presence shaping routines, expectations, and memories. The city's buildings witness births and farewells, triumphs and failures, anonymity and intimacy. They hold these moments quietly, without judgment, accumulating human presence within their walls. And so the story continues, carried forward not by any single building or vision, but by the collective act of inhabiting space. Each person who arrives adds weight to the city's architectural meaning simply by living within it. New York's architecture endures because it accepts this role, not as a finished artifact, but as a framework for ongoing life. As long as people continue to argue, dream, build, adapt, and remain, the city will keep reshaping itself. Architecture will follow, sometimes leading, sometimes responding, always entangled in the same restless energy. There will be no final form, no definitive skyline, no closing paragraph. Only continuation, layer upon layer of space, memory, and ambition extending forward, unfinished by design, because in New York, to finish would be to stop becoming. In its final essence, the history of architecture in New York resolves not into a summary, but into an understanding. The city proves that architecture is never merely about buildings, it is about endurance under pressure. Every structure stands as evidence of negotiation between land and ambition, between memory and necessity, between individual desire and collective life. New York has never waited for perfect conditions to build. It builds amid uncertainty, conflict, and contradiction, and that is precisely why its architecture remains alive. What distinguishes New York is not that it builds big, tall, or fast, but that it keeps building without losing awareness of what came before. Even when mistakes are made, they are absorbed into the city's fabric and repurposed as lessons. Few cities allow failure to coexist so visibly with success. In New York, abandoned ideas do not vanish. They linger as foundations, outlines, or repurposed shells, shaping what follows. Architecture here is cumulative wisdom rather than linear progress. The city's buildings do not promise permanence, yet they resist disappearance. They survive through adaptation, through new uses, new meanings, and new inhabitants. This constant redefinition allows architecture to age without becoming obsolete. A structure's value is measured less by its original intent and more by its capacity to remain useful, meaningful, and inhabited over time. Ultimately, New York's architecture tells a single enduring truth: a city is not finished when it is built. It is finished only when it stops changing. As long as people continue to arrive, to dream, to struggle, and to imagine better futures within limited space, the city will keep reshaping itself. Its architecture will continue to rise, bend, adapt, and endure, not as monuments to certainty, but as evidence of an ongoing human effort to belong. That is the real legacy of architecture in New York, not a skyline frozen in time, but a living structure shaped by generations who refuse to accept finality. The city does not seek an ending. It seeks continuation. And as long as that desire exists, New York's architecture will remain unfinished by design, by necessity, and by spirit.